biggest thing was just getting people to hear my side. I want this abuse to stop. It's just, enough is enough.
He's got a towel just kind of covering his mouth that's secured by duct tape, and he's handcuffed.
Revenge is a very motivating factor in a lot of things you do in life, and you know, when it escalates to murder, it's pretty extreme.
What people didn't know is what was happening behind the scenes.
You keep on doing something to somebody, you know, over and over and over again. In due time, yes, they are gonna snap.
2007, police in Queens, New York receive a mysterious call from a frantic young woman.
Police operator 1937, where's the emergency?
Somebody's bleeding to death. Please send it.
What room, ma'am?
The woman reports that there's someone bleeding to death on a third-floor apartment.
What's the phone number there, please? You're calling me from?
There's no phone number.
And she hangs up, giving no further details.
Within minutes, police and paramedics arrive at the address and rush upstairs. At the same time, the 911 dispatcher traces the number and gets the caller back on the line.
Someone called for the police at 4:30. I did. Well, that's where the police are now, coming to the third floor. There. Who's there? His name is Eric.
Once again, the caller hangs up before providing more information.
When police show up to the scene, the door was wide open, and they find a man laying on the floor in handcuffs and gagged.
But the woman who called wasn't present.
He's got a towel just kind of covering his mouth that's secured by duct tape, and he's handcuffed and non-responsive at that point.
Paramedics tried CPR, but it was too late. The gentleman was already dead and pronounced dead on the scene.
They're able to ID the man as Eric Goodrich, who's someone very well known within the community and a prominent businessman from Liberia.
Eric Goodrich was born and raised in Liberia, but in his 20s, he left to start a new life in America with his girlfriend, Lucy Ann Harris, and her children.
Eric and Lucy migrated to the United States from Liberia with the two boys and settled down in the Staten Island area of New York, where there's a large population of Liberians.
Eric worked hard to get ahead. By the early 1980s, he was running a successful limousine service and an import-export company. He and Lucy also added 4 more children to their family. Unfortunately, the good times wouldn't last.
Despite how successful Eric was at providing for his family, his relationship with Lucy had its dark side. Because not long after the youngest child was born, he started a relationship and left the family for another woman.
Lucy struggled to raise the children on her own. And in 1983, she made a decision that changed all of their lives.
Lucy went to her grandfather's funeral in Liberia.
Mom left when I was 2, and she left on a laissez-passer, which is a cheaper form of a passport, and she didn't get her green card or her citizenship when she was here. So she wasn't allowed to come back, even though she had 6 children here.
The children basically bounced around to various foster homes till Eric came and took them in.
So my very first memory is I was in foster care, and I remember being on top of a bunk bed. I remember looking down and somebody was saying, "You're going to your new home." I was going back to my dad.
Eric's new wife became the children's stepmother, but work continued to pull him away.
Growing up as a kid, I just knew that my dad had a lot of money. He was well off. You know, he had a travel agency, import-export company, record studio. He did fairly well.
He was an entrepreneur. He had like a limousine company, a real estate, but he just traveled a lot.
Also secretive, very secretive. a lot of things that was just swept under the rug. But he did have a lot of people that loved him. You know, he did a lot for people.
In 1990, Eric returned to his home country to take a job with the Liberian Ministry of Transport, while the kids stayed with their stepmom in the States. When his temporary gig extended for months, his family once again fell apart.
At some point, my stepmother got tired of him and divorced him, and then she didn't want to take care of us, which is understandable. I don't blame her either. And she sent us to his family. So that's when we moved to Providence, Rhode Island to live with my aunt and grandmother, which is his sister and mother. But they were mad because Eric left us in their care and they had to take care of us, and he wasn't giving them money to take care of us.
In February 1994, the children got the chance to reunite with their birth mother in Liberia.
I didn't see her again until I was 12, and that's when my paternal family sent me and my brothers back to Liberia. My initial impression of Liberia was culture shock. They were going through a civil war at the time.
But the love that we got from my mother, first meeting her, seemed very genuine. It was something that we didn't get from my grandparents and aunt. And it only lasted for about a week, 2 weeks. After that, things changed pretty quick.
The warm reception devolved into what the kids describe as being mostly ignored, as if they were an imposition. The kids saw their father Eric occasionally. Then in April 1996, the Civil War got even more dangerous.
It was scary. It was scary. At one point, we would sit out on the porch at night and see the bullets whizzing by. It was like firecrackers. And then every day worrying, is your family gonna be next? Because all people talked about was the rebels.
In 1996, my mother somehow was able to get our documents that we were American citizens, and we got airlifted back here.
Over the following decade, Eric traveled back and forth between the States and Liberia and remained distant from the kids. But in the summer of 2007, things changed when he was diagnosed with cancer.
His health started declining, so he came back to the US in 2007 to seek better medical treatment. Once he realized his cancer might be terminal, Eric decided to reconcile with his children.
Now, at 55 years old, Eric has been found dead in a New York apartment, and police are beginning their investigation.
There's things that you look at first. Obviously, it's important that the door was left open. You have somebody gagged and bound. Your first thought would be a robbery, a home invasion.
But why would a home invader call 911 to report the crime?
If somebody would call 911 and tell you somebody's bleeding, more often than not, that person would stay and greet the police when you got there. So given the fact that nobody was there except for Eric, you would have to think that whoever called 911 is the person that was somehow involved in this murder.
After investigators secure the crime scene where Eric Goodridge was killed, they conduct a search of the apartment. A closer look at Eric's body reveals that he was tortured.
Detectives didn't see a lot of blood. The first noticed was some small amount of blood around the groin area. Upon further inspection, they noticed that his penis was cut off. The police found a scalpel not too far from the body, and it was determined that that was the weapon used.
However, as traumatic as that must have been, it wasn't how he died.
Eric was found with a towel that was jammed down his throat and then duct taped around the rest of his face, leaving his nose exposed and his eyes. This usually indicates that the person wasn't trying to kill them because they were leaving their nose open so that they could breathe.
What we learn is that the gagging reflex little by little, just kept on grabbing that towel to the back of his throat where it cut off the airway. So even though someone looking at him might say he can breathe, his nostrils are exposed, ultimately after the struggle, the towel went to the back of his throat, which cut off that airway to his nostrils.
At first glance, detectives would believe that this was a robbery based on the fact that he was bound and gagged. But once you discovered that the penis was cut off, it would go in a different direction. It probably lead you to believe that this was more of a personal vendetta, somebody that had a personal problem with Eric. Upon further inspection of the crime scene, there was 2 notes that were discovered. One note that said, "He wrecked my life," which could be a host of different people. It could be an ex-lover, it could be his present wife, it could be an ex-wife. And the second note said, "At first, I blamed myself. Now I know it's not my fault." But once we were going in the direction of this is a domestic incident, you have to, the number one thing you would do, the first thing to do is try and identify who that 911 caller was. And then you want to see who might have a problem with Eric.
Looking for answers, dispatchers once again called the woman who originally called 911.
Hello? Yes, hi. This is New York City Police Department. Someone called for the police? Yeah.
The woman identifies herself as Bridget Harris.
And who is Eric? Your father? Who is Eric?
Yeah, is he alive?
Is who alive?
Eric.
I don't know. What happened to Eric?
All right, forget it.
Instead of answering the question, Bridget says she's on her way to a police station to explain what she knows.
It appeared this is something that's very personal. It was a vendetta. It was something revenge-oriented. And this was something we needed to find out from Bridget.
But Bridget never shows up at the precinct. Continuing to process the apartment, investigators establish that it belongs to Bridget. They also obtain a search warrant for Bridget's computer.
They were able to find out through this warrant that Bridget ordered a scalpel over the internet, and it was delivered to her home. The fact that somebody ordered days in advance the scalpel is the biggest indicator that it's something that was premeditated and thought out. We also found on the computer that Bridget had Googled the Lorraine Bobbitt case.
In 1993, Lorena Bobbitt famously castrated her husband, John Bobbitt, then called 911 and confessed what she'd done. John survived the attack.
Bridget went online and researched what happens if you cut off someone's penis, and that the results that they got is that the blood would coagulate and you don't die.
Bridget's computer reveals something else as well, a video confession recorded 2 days before her father died.
She went and made a video about what she was going to do, but asking everyone to not judge her until they knew everything.
While homicide detectives are scouring the city looking for Bridget Harris, she's contemplating her next move.
I sat at the library. The library is right across the street from the police station, and I just was thinking. And because the dispatcher never really said what was going on, whether he was alive or whether they had got to him in time, I was nervous. My first thoughts are suicide.
She decides to turn to her sister for help.
For some reason, I don't know what made me do it, but I called Carlene. I told her I was on my way to the police station. And she said, "Don't go in, because I won't see you again." And I did not expect her to say that. I didn't expect her to support me at all. Carlene picked me up, took me to Staten Island, and then realized what my full plan was, and then called the ambulance for me and had me checked in.
Bridget is admitted to the psychiatric ward of the Richmond University Medical Center and placed on suicide watch. Bridget's sister contacts attorney Arthur Aidala through a mutual friend, and he agrees to meet with Bridget.
When I went to go see Bridget, she was on suicide watch. She was sitting at a table covered in a white sheet. And if she could have like just crawled into the earth, like that's what she wanted.
I was just out of it. I was started on a regimen of pills that very first night, and I had never been on any kind of mental pills either. So I had sleeping pills, anti-anxiety pills, anti-depression pills.
I do remember there was a man of the clergy who came in. He was being so sweet and he was being so nice, but I remember at one point he touched Bridget, like on her shoulder. And I remember her recoiling. And I was like, well, this poor young lady is in a lot of pain, man. I mean, a lot of pain.
Over the next 24 hours, Bridget Harris tells her story. According to her, Eric Goodridge is not the man most people think he is.
What people saw about what was happening with Eric is that he was very supportive of his children. What people didn't know is what was happening behind the scenes. Bridget said he was been molesting and raping Bridget since she's 3 years old.
My first memory of the abuse by Eric was in the guest bedroom of the house in Long Island. He took me in the room and I thought I was gonna get punished for something. I remember my stepmother wasn't home. It was just me and my 2 brothers. And he took my clothes off, got on top of me, and of course I was 3. I didn't know what was happening. I just knew he was hurting me. People say, why didn't you tell someone? When you're a child, you don't know what sex is. And that's not sex, first of all. You don't know what's happening. And the way he did it, you know, he had the belt in his hand. You're being punished for not cleaning your room.
She was so young, she could not know how to process the trauma.
You only know what you know in your family, so you don't know what the rest of the world looks like and what's expected of you as a child. So you begin to personalize it as a child. Is what am I doing for him to do these things to me?
Bridget says the abuse continued throughout her childhood, becoming more violent over time.
I remember talking about a time when she was washing the dishes and she broke a dish, and her father took a switch, a stick, and beat her on her arm until it bled.
If she told someone, they then moved to somewhere else, and it happened again.
My sister, Carlene, she never wanted to talk about it. I know we were both abused by him, but every time we brought it up, she, changed the subject or didn't want to talk about it.
Nobody believed her. The community validated him as being such a good person that they kept believing that Bridget was making up stories about him and didn't want to see the fact that he was behind closed doors. He was a different person. He was a monster.
I feel like I could have gone to more people, to be honest, but for that to have happened, I would have had to have more support. I would have had to have more trust in people. I would have had to have seen him gotten in trouble, to see him get away with it each and every time, and nobody really doing anything. That's why I just stopped talking about it.
After Bridget and her siblings returned to the States in 1996, the well-connected Eric traveled back and forth between the 2 countries, sometimes taking Bridget with him.
He took me back in 1997 by myself, without my brothers. So I was living with him for about a year, and the abuse got out of control. Like, he just didn't care anymore. Because I knew there's no law over there. He's gonna be able to do whatever he wants. I knew nobody was gonna stop him.
She says she endured the abuse until she was 18 years old.
It was a very horrible one. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
I didn't just lay there this time. I fought him off. And he was actually shocked. He was like, what's wrong with you? You thought there was something wrong with me for saying no.
They gave her the strength. She was older now, and she was 18. She was emancipated to run away.
Being that Bridget was now an adult, she returned to the U.S. Embassy where she received financial assistance to come back to the U.S. and finally escape her father's sexual abuse.
I had another little sister there. That was my only regret, is leaving her, because I knew that he was going to abuse her as well. But I was just like, I need to go.
Once in the U.S., Bridget had a very difficult time bouncing around through relatives' homes. She ended up living in a woman's shelter. It wasn't until 7 years later, in 2006, where she was able to get her own apartment and finally live on her own.
I had friends, I was going out, going to concerts, I had a good job, I had my own place, everything I ever wanted. I just wanted to be alone. I was finally alone in my own apartment, and I still wasn't happy. Trying to get in a relationship with anyone was hard, and suicide was on my mind literally every day. Just constantly thought about suicide.
Then, in the summer of 2007, Bridget's abuser came back into her life.
Bridget received a call from her sister, Carlene, where she told her that her father was in town. He was actually at her house. She wanted her to come over to make amends.
When I found out he was back, I was like, okay, before I kill myself, maybe I can make sure that he's not going to hurt anyone else.
Two days have passed since 55-year-old Eric Goodrich was found dead, and investigators are still searching for his daughter, Bridget. Their next contact is from Bridget's lawyer, who explains where she is.
We found out that she went to a psychiatric ward in Staten Island. It appeared that, this is somebody that's seeking help for what she did. Normally, a detective's condition is whodunit. On this particular case, at some point you know who did it, the person confessed to it. So it's unique that now you're trying to investigate why this happened.
Bridget shares her harrowing story with police, claiming that the chain of events resulting in her father's death started when her sister asked her to come over to make amends with Eric.
The first thing that Bridget sees when she opened the door is her father bouncing her knees on his leg, just like he used to do to her, and that triggered her.
It was straight trigger, flashback. Just the fact that he's touching her, I have this issue with, and it's anyone, unfortunately. It's when I see my brothers kissing their own daughters, I get cringy. It's not something that they're doing, it's just what I remember happening to me. So to see my abuser actually touching a little girl again was, yeah.
The one thing that set Bridget over the edge was hearing her father say that he wanted to take Carlene's daughters back to Liberia. Bridget knew that if her father succeeded in taking her nieces back to Liberia, they would only be subjected to the same sexual abuse that she was subjected to.
Carlene told me he was there to make amends and, things are gonna be different, and I didn't see it that way.
Colleen really felt he was going to do nothing to her children. It was Bridget who had the fear and didn't trust him.
In her mind, he was old, sickly, he's not gonna do this again. But I didn't believe that. I just didn't think he was gonna change.
Bridget said, I love these kids. I'm not going to allow what happened to me happen to them.
To me, the justice system wasn't gonna be able to do anything. And I had already gone the route of trying to tell his family, and that didn't go anywhere.
According to Bridget, she didn't want to kill Eric, just prevent him from abusing anyone else.
And that's where the research and the idea started over those next number of weeks, where she started doing research about what would happen to her father if she did this. Would he die? Would he not? And the research all showed that he shouldn't die from that injury. And then she started to take steps and order the necessary equipment, a scalpel.
Now, she needed to get access to Eric.
I convinced him to come to my place and talk about it. I printed out some things that I was going to talk to him about. The psychological damages that kids who suffer from abuse go through, thinking we were actually going to have this talk. And then that was the backup plan. Like, if he didn't, say he was going to change or stop, then I was going to stop him.
Bridget Harris explains to police that she planned to confront her father, Eric Goodridge, to stop his sexual abuse.
I was living in Queens at the time, and Carlin was in Staten Island, so I met him at the Staten Island ferry in the city, and we took the train back to my apartment.
She wanted to talk to him about what happened and how it's important for him to be in denial that what he did to her was not okay, and it was abuse, sexual abuse. At that point, he got very angry at Bridget and started telling her, you're making stories up.
Automatically, he starts with the same lies. That's not how it happened, you're remembering it wrong. But I know what he did. There's a lot of girls out there who know what he did. There's family members out there who know what he did.
The more he was denying what happened, the more she felt she had to do something.
So I'm like, he's definitely not changing. This is worthless. That's pretty much what I screamed at him. I was like, you're a horrible person. You know what you did. You're not gonna change. You're gonna keep doing it. I'm gonna make sure you don't.
Her intention was to take his weapon away. And to her, his penis was his weapon. It's how he assaulted her multiple times, all over the world. And her fear was that he was going to now use this weapon against her niece.
I pulled out the pepper sprayed him. At some point, I don't know how, but he got knocked out. And then I ran and got the handcuffs, and I handcuffed him. And I remember he was breathing weird, so I splashed some water on his face. And when he woke up, he saw his hands and he started screaming. And to stop him screaming, I got a towel and put it in his mouth, which was the worst mistake.
It's not really a detective's job to work out a defense for Ms. Harris, but with respect to what you're going to charge her with, you have to know the why, because premeditated murder is different than something that is not premeditated, that's not murder.
She had no intention to suffocate him. She was leaving an airway open. She was trying to keep him from screaming or being heard.
So then I remembered, got the scalpel, and then cut it off. I remember the first thing I did was put it on the stove, because I just knew they were going to reattach it, and I didn't want that to happen. So I tried to burn it. And the smell actually kind of brought me back to like, oh crap, I just did this. I turned the stove off and I called 911.
Police operator 1937, where's the emergency?
Before I left, I looked over and I thought I saw him breathing, but obviously he wasn't. So I knew something was wrong, but I honestly did not want him to die. Dying for me, for him, is just too easy. That wasn't the best punishment, I guess you could say. Because he's dead and that's it, How many women did he hurt? How many girls did he hurt? He didn't pay for hurting them. And it wasn't up to me to take him out because I wasn't the only one that he hurt. So it wasn't about that. I just wanted him to stop hurting people.
Bridget's plan, after taking her father's weapon away, was that she was going to go down to the beach. She always loved the beach. And she had always planned to go down to the beach and to kill herself. Instead of killing herself, she reaches out to her sister and she starts to get help.
After getting Bridget's full story, authorities need to look into it.
At this point now, we're going to take steps to either disprove or prove what she's alleging. So the allegation is that she's been sexually abused, so we're going to take steps to see if there's any proof that this happened. So normally the first thing you want to do is find out who she told during the course of the abuse. Not like yesterday, but, did she tell her friends 5 years ago? Because you want to verify this abuse independent of what Bridget's saying.
With their father gone, Bridget's siblings decide to come forward with their own stories.
I would see the way he would grope my sisters, smack their butt. And I would see things that just didn't look right, but I was too young to really have any idea of what was really going on. The first time I remember her telling me, I just moved to Rhode Island. This was in 2001, and that's when I remember her telling me. I think I could have gave her more attention, try to do something about it. Speak up to other adults, but I didn't. I feel like girls look to their brothers to protect them. I looked to her to protect me, and every time she always did. And at the moment when she needed me, I couldn't return that favor.
However, other members of the influential family publicly refute claims of abuse.
There was a lot of people on my father's side that decided that Bridget's no longer part of the family, and if I choose to communicate with her, then I'm no longer part of the family either. It's nothing new. That's how we grew up. There was a lot of people that were around and wasn't around. Real love, fake love.
Bridget's attorney works to get ahead in the court of public opinion.
What needs to be taken into consideration is the history between her and the deceased, is the fact that she was subjected to a monster. A father who's supposed to protect his daughter at all costs preyed upon her.
Bridget spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility. After she was released, the police came and arrested her for the murder of Eric.
Before her 2009 trial, Bridget Harris is charged with both second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter.
We were able to get the judge to charge manslaughter in the second degree as a reckless act, and that this towel was a reckless act.
I don't know if Bridget ever expressed remorse, but she did make clear that she knew what she did was wrong. And she did make clear that she was willing to accept punishment, just not excessive punishment.
Bridget had the opportunity to plead guilty in this case to a lesser sentence and a lesser charge, and she had turned that down. And I remember the look on her face, really thinking about it and saying, no, I have to tell my story. I'm going to take that chance.
In September 2009, Bridget Harris's trial for the death of her father, Eric Goodridge, is underway. Her attorneys hope the jury will be able to look past what happened and understand why.
Obviously, the evidence of a premeditation was here for someone who had no psychiatric history, right? She thought about this, she made a plan, she made a video, she said, this is what I'm going to do, and then she followed through on it. What this case boiled down to is, what does it all mean? What was going on in her head? How was she impacted by all the prior years of abuse and the recent events as her father came back into her life?
It wasn't if she did it. It wasn't even really so much why she did it. It was just, can we crawl into that jury box? Can we convince 12 people that justice is not putting her in jail?
My biggest thing was just getting people to hear my side, get the facts, because you're gonna judge. I know you're gonna judge, but just get the facts.
On September 21st, 2009, Bridget Harris takes the stand in her own defense.
So she's telling the world about the most personal, horrible things that happened to her. We summarized the abuse that started at 3, which was horrible, and went all the way until she was 18. Remember, the line I kept saying is, I wish I could stop there, folks, but I can't, because there's more.
Bridget finds the strength to testify about the most traumatic experiences anyone could imagine and what it did to her.
I didn't have the names for it, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I was definitely helpless. I felt that what was the point to living?
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't kill yourself.
Me too.
The prosecution here never really disputed the abuse. We were fortunate in that respect. They acknowledged that Bridget was credible, was being truthful about the abuse that she suffered.
What'd the prosecutor do? She did the smartest thing she could do. She basically stood there and she's saying, on this date, on this time, did you intend to cut off your father's penis? Yes. Would you consider that to be seriously physically injuring him? Yes. And you gagged him, right? Yes. And then he died? Yes. And those are all the elements of manslaughter in the first degree? Yes. So now you have this woman charged with murder, just admitted that she satisfied all of the elements at the very least of manslaughter in the first degree.
The jury deliberates for less than 3 hours.
When they said there's a verdict, my heart was pounding. And I have the verdict sheet right in front of me that the jurors have. How do you find the defendant, Bridget Harris, on the first count of murder in the second degree? Not guilty, I check it off. How do you find the defendant, Bridget Harris, in the second count of manslaughter in the first degree?
They had found her not guilty of murder in the second degree. They had found her not guilty of manslaughter in the first degree, which was also an intentional act. So this was definitely a victory.
Instead, the jury finds Bridget guilty on the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter, the unintentional killing of someone without legal justification.
The real unique part is, I believe it was 9 jurors, 9 of the 12 came to the sentencing and sat right in the front row so that the judge could see them. They had already written letters to the judge asking for no jail. Please don't sentence her to any more jail, just let her go.
But Judge Cooperman decided to sentence her to the maximum that he was allowed to under the law, which was a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15. And what that meant is that Bridget would come up for parole after 5 years.
I was relieved for it to be over, happy that it wasn't as horrible as I thought it was gonna be, and just hopeful for the future, thinking, okay, the secret's out, now I can start healing, maybe I can have a future, maybe I can be happy. And then the jury too, just the fact that the jury was on my side, I didn't expect people to be on my side at all. At all.
When she finally came home 5 years later, I was excited. We took the drive to Brooklyn to go and get her. It was just good to have her back.
Bridget, to this day, has been a productive, functioning member of society. And it's great to see that she's now reaching the potential that she should have been able to reach when she was a little girl.
Eventually, I want to own a restaurant, multiple restaurants, starting with the food truck. But more importantly, what I'm working on right now is writing my memoirs, getting everything down, because I do want to advocate for survivors of abuse. I want it to end. I want to break the cycle.
I think that what happened to Bridget is something that is important for us to learn from, because I think that when children say they're being hurt, we should listen.
This story is tragic and very heartbreaking, but it is more common than we think. Child sexual abuse is a global issue. We need to protect.
January 14th, 1975. England was deep in the grip of winter. Long before midnight, the cold had settled over the countryside like a heavy blanket, swallowing roads, rooftops, and empty fields beneath a silence that seemed almost unnatural. The villages slept behind drawn curtains. Porch lights glowed faintly through drifting mist. Somewhere in the distance, a train crossed the darkness, its sound fading almost as quickly as it arrived. It was the kind of night most people would forget the moment morning came. For one family, it would become the dividing line between life before and life after. Inside a comfortable home in the quiet county of Staffordshire, 17-year-old Leslie Whittle had every reason to believe tomorrow would be ordinary. She belonged to a family that had worked hard to build a successful business. Friends described her as cheerful, polite, and quietly independent. Her future was still unwritten, filled with the ordinary hopes that occupy the minds of teenagers. School, family gatherings, conversations about the future, and the simple expectation that another sunrise would come. Outside, hidden somewhere beyond the reach of the streetlights, another person was waiting. He had already spent weeks preparing for this night. He knew the routines. He knew the property. He knew how many people lived inside. He knew which windows remained dark the longest. Most importantly, he knew exactly how much the family was worth. This was not an act of impulse. It was the final stage of a carefully rehearsed plan. Across Britain, police forces had already begun speaking quietly about an elusive armed robber who seemed almost impossible to catch. He rarely left useful evidence behind. He appeared without warning, disappeared before officers could arrive, and seemed to understand police procedures almost as well as the detectives hunting him. Newspapers had started calling him the Black Panther, inspired by the dark clothing he often wore while moving through the night. The nickname painted the image of a mysterious predator, slipping silently through shadows before vanishing into the darkness once again. Behind the dramatic headlines stood a far more unsettling reality. There was nothing supernatural about him. He was patient. He was disciplined. He believed preparation mattered more than luck. While investigators searched for a violent robber, the man they were looking for had already begun thinking beyond robbery. Money stolen from post offices and small businesses came with growing risks. Security measures were improving. Police patrols were increasing. Every successful escape narrowed his future options. Kidnapping promised something different. One victim. One family. One enormous payment. At least, that was how the plan looked on paper. The reality would become one of Britain's most heartbreaking criminal cases. The man waiting outside that winter night had another name before the newspapers transformed him into a legend of fear. Donald Neilson. Born Donald Nappy in 1936, he had once worn a military uniform instead of dark clothing. He had served in the British Army years before becoming one of the country's most wanted criminals. Neighbors who knew him described an unremarkable husband and father. He lived quietly. He avoided unnecessary attention. He did not fit the public image people imagined when they heard the word murderer. That contradiction would later haunt investigators. How could someone appear so ordinary while living such an extraordinary double life? The answer was hidden beneath years of careful discipline. Neilson planned almost everything. He observed targets before acting. He studied escape routes. He timed police responses. He practiced movements until they became instinctive. Where others relied on confidence, he relied on preparation. Every successful crime reinforced the belief that planning could overcome almost any obstacle. By January 1975, that belief had become dangerous. Because every criminal who survives long enough eventually reaches a point where previous successes begin to feel like proof of invincibility. The roads around the Whittle home were almost empty. A passing driver would have seen nothing unusual. A parked vehicle. Dark hedgerows. Cold air hanging over quiet fields. Nothing suggested history was about to change. Inside the house, normal life continued for a few more moments. No alarms. No frantic phone calls. No flashing blue lights. Only the comforting rhythm shared by countless families every night before sleep. History often begins that way. Not with explosions. Not with screaming. But with ordinary moments whose importance becomes visible only in hindsight. Somewhere beyond those walls, a man was moving with deliberate precision. Every step had been imagined before it was taken. Every risk had been calculated. Every minute mattered. Unlike crimes driven by anger or desperation, this one unfolded according to a schedule. That was perhaps the most chilling part. It had been designed. The difference between a spontaneous act of violence and a carefully planned crime is often invisible to the victim. But investigators would later recognize it immediately. Nothing about this kidnapping was accidental. The target had been selected. The location had been studied. The ransom demand had already been considered. Even the hiding place had been chosen long before Leslie Whittle ever realized someone was watching. Far away, police officers worked night shifts like any other evening. Radio operators answered routine calls. Patrol cars cruised familiar streets. No one knew that within hours, an investigation would begin that would consume enormous resources, dominate national headlines, and expose failures that would be debated for decades. The coming days would become a race against time. Every hour would matter. Every misunderstanding would carry consequences. Every delay would feel unbearable. Yet none of that was visible on this quiet winter night. The darkness concealed everything equally. It hid frightened families. It hid determined detectives. And it hid one man whose patience had finally reached its end. In later years, documentaries, books, and newspaper archives would often focus on Donald Nielsen's reputation as an elusive criminal. They would examine his methods, his military background, his calculated approach, and the nickname that transformed him into a near-mythical figure. But those details, however fascinating they may appear to students of criminal history, risk overshadowing something far more important. At the center of this story was never a notorious outlaw. It was a 17-year-old girl whose future disappeared in a single winter night. True crime often tempts audiences to admire intelligence when a criminal avoids capture. Long investigations create suspense. Elaborate disguises seem cinematic. Successful escapes resemble scenes from fiction. Real life is different. Every carefully planned crime leaves behind ordinary people forced to carry extraordinary grief. Parents who continue setting an empty place at the table. Friends who struggle to understand how normal conversations became final conversations. Investigators who replay every decision, wondering whether one different choice could have changed everything. Communities that never again experience safety in quite the same way. That is where this story truly begins. Not with the hunter, but with those who never chose to become part of his plans. Because before Britain knew the name Donald Nielsen, before newspapers printed the words Black Panther across their front pages, before police assembled one of the country's largest manhunts, there was simply another cold January evening. A family believed tomorrow would arrive exactly as yesterday had. A teenager expected to wake up in her own bedroom. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets, a man carrying years of preparation stepped forward from the darkness, convinced that he had accounted for every possible outcome. He was wrong. Not because his plan would fail immediately, but because crimes built on control have a way of collapsing under the weight of the one thing no planner can ever fully predict. Human beings. Fear changes decisions. Pressure creates mistakes. Time erodes confidence. And once the first move is made, even the most disciplined criminal no longer controls every piece on the board. The night had only just begun. The most infamous chapter in Donald Nielsen's criminal career was about to unfold, and with it, Britain would witness a case that forever changed the way the nation understood kidnapping, ransom negotiations, and the devastating cost of believing that one perfect plan could ever remain perfect once real lives became part of it. The first hours after a crime are often described as the most important. Detectives measure them in opportunities gained or lost. Every passing minute can erase footprints beneath fresh rain, scatter witnesses across towns, or allow a suspect to place another mile between himself and the people searching for him. But there is another clock that begins ticking at exactly the same moment, one that no investigator can stop. It is the clock inside a family home, where every unanswered phone call stretches longer than it should, where every glance toward the front door carries a little more uncertainty, and where ordinary concern slowly hardens into fear. That clock would begin its relentless march before anyone outside the Whittle family understood what had happened. For the man who set these events into motion, however, time was something entirely different. He had spent years teaching himself to think in hours instead of seconds, in preparation instead of reaction. Long before his name became known across Britain, Donald Nielsen had learned to wait. Waiting had become almost a discipline. Waiting for patrol cars to leave an area. Waiting for businesses to close. Waiting for neighborhoods to fall asleep. Waiting until silence became so complete that even the smallest sound seemed amplified by the darkness. Patience was not simply part of his method. It was his method. Many violent offenders are driven by impulse. Their decisions are hurried, emotional, unpredictable. Nielsen represented something more unsettling. He believed that enough observation could remove uncertainty from a crime. If he watched long enough, planned carefully enough, rehearsed enough possibilities, he could reduce risk until success became almost inevitable. It was an illusion. But it was an illusion strengthened by experience. Throughout the early 1970s, he had managed to evade one police investigation after another. Armed robberies had shaken small communities throughout northern England. Post offices and isolated businesses became targets because they appeared vulnerable. Employees often worked with little protection. Rural locations delayed police response. By the time officers arrived, the gunman had usually disappeared. Each successful escape became another lesson. Each lesson became another habit. Each habit reinforced his confidence. Investigators later reconstructed a portrait of a man who approached crime with the same determination others devoted to ordinary careers. He studied maps. He examined roads that most drivers ignored. He looked for abandoned structures that offered concealment. He considered weather conditions, visibility, traffic patterns, and escape routes. None of these actions made him a criminal mastermind. They made him methodical, and methodical offenders can remain undetected far longer than those who rely only on recklessness. Yet even the most detailed plans reveal something about the planner. Donald Nielsen feared uncertainty. He sought control because control promised safety. The irony is impossible to ignore. A man willing to terrorize strangers spent much of his own life trying to protect himself from unpredictability. That contradiction would echo throughout the investigation. By the time Leslie Whittle entered his plan, Nielsen was no longer thinking like a robber searching for the next cash register. He was thinking in larger sums, convinced that one carefully chosen kidnapping could achieve what years of smaller crimes never had. Wealth attracted attention, but it also created opportunity. Public knowledge of successful businesses, inheritances, and prosperous families often spread through local communities. Information did not need the internet to travel. Conversations in pubs, newspapers reporting business success, and casual local gossip could provide enough fragments for someone determined to assemble a target. The Whittle family fit the profile he believed he understood. From a distance, prosperity can appear simple. Inside every family, reality is always more complicated. No amount of financial success can prepare parents for the disappearance of a child. No amount of planning can soften the shock of discovering that home, the place people instinctively associate with safety, has been violated. For investigators, crimes committed inside or around private homes carry a particular emotional weight. They represent more than violence. They attack the idea that a locked door separates ordinary life from extraordinary danger. That illusion shattered in Staffordshire during one bitter winter night. Outside, frost continued forming across gardens and parked cars. The air remained so cold that each breath lingered before disappearing into darkness. The landscape itself seemed frozen in place, untouched by the violence unfolding within it. Nature has an unsettling indifference to human tragedy. Dawn still arrives. Birds still begin their morning calls. Roads fill with commuters who know nothing about the lives forever changed only a few miles away. Morning would come. Newspapers would be delivered. Shops would open. Children would walk to school. The world would continue moving while one family entered the longest days of their lives. This contrast lies at the heart of nearly every major criminal case. Public attention eventually transforms victims into headlines, photographs, and timelines. Yet before cameras arrive, before reporters gather outside houses, grief exists in complete privacy. It lives in unanswered questions. It hides in silent kitchens. It grows with every hour that refuses to provide an explanation. Long before Britain became fascinated by the mystery of the Black Panther, there was simply confusion. Where was Leslie? Why had she disappeared? Could she still be alive? Questions like these become almost unbearable because they offer no immediate answers. Families cling to hope not because hope feels reasonable but because the alternative is impossible to accept. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond public view, Donald Nielsen believed events were still unfolding according to his design. That belief would not survive. Investigations rarely unfold as neatly as crime novels suggest. Evidence arrives unevenly. Witnesses remember details differently. Rumors compete with facts. Officers pursue promising leads only to discover they point nowhere. Entire days of work can collapse because one assumption proves false. Yet persistence often succeeds where certainty fails. The officers assigned to this case did not know they were chasing a man who had spent years refining his ability to disappear. Nor did Nielsen fully appreciate the cumulative power of countless small observations made by ordinary people. History tends to celebrate dramatic breakthroughs, a fingerprint, a confession, a decisive witness. In reality, many investigations advance through fragments so ordinary they seem insignificant on their own. A remembered vehicle. An unusual conversation. A receipt. A map. A routine traffic stop. Tiny details gather until they begin forming the outline of someone who once believed he had left nothing behind. Donald Nielsen's confidence rested on the assumption that preparation could eliminate chance. But chance has always been one of the most persistent investigators. It appears without warning. It rewards patience. And it rarely announces itself until long after the critical moment has passed. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that disaster was inevitable from the very beginning, that every decision pointed toward the tragic ending history now records. Real life never feels that clear while it is happening. People make choices with limited information. Detectives follow evidence they have, not evidence they wish existed. Families hold on to hope because there is nothing else to hold. That uncertainty is what made this case so agonizing. Every development suggested that time remained. Every delay quietly reduced it. As Britain would soon discover, the story of Donald Nielsen was never simply the story of an elusive criminal. It was the story of how meticulous planning collided with human unpredictability, how one calculated decision unleashed consequences far beyond its original purpose, and how an entire nation found itself watching a desperate search unfold with the same question echoing through homes, police stations, and newspaper offices alike. Could they find her before it was too late? Even decades later, when the names have settled into history books and the photographs have faded into grainy black and white archives, there remains something deeply unsettling about the opening chapter of this case. It is not simply the violence that would follow. It is the realization that, for weeks, perhaps even months, two completely different lives had been moving toward one another without ever meeting. On one side was a teenage girl whose days revolved around family, friends, familiar streets, and the quiet assumptions that shape ordinary life. She had plans extending beyond the next weekend, beyond the next birthday, beyond the next year. Like countless young people, she imagined the future as something that would naturally arrive. On the other side was a man who viewed the same future as a series of calculations. Distances. Timetables. Escape routes. Blind spots. He looked at neighborhoods not as communities but as diagrams. He looked at houses not as homes but as targets. He looked at people not as individuals but as variables inside a plan. That difference in perspective is what makes certain crimes so difficult to comprehend. The victim is living a life. The offender is constructing an operation. Those two realities exist separately until one terrible moment forces them together. Donald Nielsen had become increasingly comfortable living in that hidden world of preparation. His neighbors saw routine. His family saw familiarity. The public knew almost nothing about him. Yet behind closed doors, another identity continued to grow, one defined not by emotion or sudden rage but by relentless discipline. Discipline, however, is morally neutral. It can build bridges. It can train surgeons. It can produce great artists. Or it can allow a criminal to refine violence with frightening precision. Nielsen applied patience to the wrong purpose. Instead of abandoning crime after each successful escape, he treated every offense as a lesson. Every mistake became something to eliminate next time. Every close call encouraged him to prepare even more thoroughly. Success did not satisfy him. It convinced him he was improving. That is one of the most dangerous feedback loops in criminal behavior. The absence of immediate consequences can create the illusion that harmful decisions are intelligent decisions. By early 1975, that illusion had reached its peak. Across Britain, newspapers continued reporting armed robberies linked to the mysterious figure they had begun calling the Black Panther. The nickname captured public imagination because it transformed uncertainty into something people could visualize. A shadow moving through darkness. A silent predator appearing without warning. Headlines often prefer symbols over complexity, and symbols have a remarkable ability to outlive facts. But real investigations are rarely driven by dramatic nicknames. Detectives were not searching for a mythical creature. They were searching for a man who could bleed, tire, panic, and eventually make mistakes. The difficulty was discovering where those mistakes would appear. Experienced investigators understand that every offender carries habits from one crime into the next. A preferred route. A familiar method. A recurring pattern so ordinary that the offender eventually stops noticing it. Criminals adapt, but they also repeat themselves. Somewhere inside repetition lies opportunity. At that moment, however, opportunity belonged to Nielsen. He believed he had selected the right victim. He believed he had chosen the right location. He believed he had anticipated every likely response. What he could not fully anticipate was the complexity of real human behavior once fear entered the equation. Fear never follows a script. Families under unimaginable pressure do not always react as criminals expect. Police officers balancing urgency with caution rarely possess perfect information. Witnesses notice details they themselves consider meaningless until much later. And time, the one resource every kidnapper believes can be controlled, has a way of slipping beyond anyone's grasp. That is why this case continues to fascinate investigators decades later. It was not only about violence. It became a study in miscalculation. Every participant believed they were acting on the best information available. Every participant was, in some way, operating in darkness. The offender could not see the investigation gathering around him. Investigators could not see where the victim was being held. The family could not know which decision offered the greatest chance of bringing their daughter home safely. Each side moved forward without seeing the complete picture. Only history would eventually assemble the entire mosaic. As the hours turned into days, Britain would become increasingly invested in a story still hidden behind closed police briefings and private family anguish. Television bulletins interrupted regular programming. Newspapers devoted front pages to new developments. Telephone operators handled an overwhelming number of public tips. Some callers believed they had seen suspicious vehicles. Others reported strangers in isolated villages. Most leads led nowhere. Yet every major investigation generates hope with each new possibility. Hope can be exhausting. It rises with promising information. It falls when evidence refuses to confirm it. Then it rises again. Detectives learn to live within that rhythm. Families are forced to endure it. The emotional distance between those two experiences is enormous. For investigators, each lead represents another task. For parents, each lead may feel like the difference between reunion and irreversible loss. The Whittle family had entered that painful reality without warning. Beyond the headlines, beyond the official statements, beyond the public speculation, there existed moments no camera ever recorded. Quiet conversations interrupted by ringing telephones. Sleepless nights measured not by hours but by unanswered questions. The impossible effort of remaining hopeful while every passing day quietly eroded certainty. Those moments rarely become the focus of famous criminal cases. Yet they are often the most human part of the story. True crime has a tendency to orbit around offenders because violence naturally attracts attention. Names like Donald Nielsen endure because criminal acts leave deep marks on public memory. But history should never allow notoriety to eclipse humanity. The lasting significance of this case is not that one man managed to evade capture for a time. It is that countless lives were permanently altered by his decisions. Police officers carried the weight of an investigation that demanded answers. Journalists found themselves reporting developments to an anxious nation while facts remained incomplete. Communities questioned assumptions about safety. Parents looked at their own children differently. The ripple effects extended far beyond one house in Staffordshire. Every notorious crime leaves behind two legacies. One belongs to the offender, preserved in court records and police files. The other belongs to everyone forced to live with the consequences. The second legacy is always larger. As this story unfolds, there will be moments of suspense, painstaking investigative work, and dramatic turns that seem almost impossible to believe. There will be discoveries that reshape the direction of the case and decisions whose consequences continue to be debated decades later. But beneath every twist lies a simple truth. This was never a contest between a brilliant criminal and determined detectives. It was a tragedy measured in lost time, broken trust, and lives that could never return to what they had been before one winter night in January 1975. The darkness that surrounded England on that evening eventually gave way to dawn, just as every night does. Roads filled with traffic. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Factory whistles marked the beginning of another working day. To most people, it was simply another January morning. For one family, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that would grip the entire nation. And for Donald Nielsen, it marked the moment when years of careful preparation crossed an invisible line from armed robbery into a crime whose consequences would define the rest of his life. The hunt had begun. Neither the hunter nor those pursuing him yet understood how much would be lost before it finally came to an end. England in the mid-1970s was a country caught between two eras. The optimism that had followed the post-war decades was giving way to uncertainty. Inflation was rising. Industrial disputes dominated newspaper headlines. Power cuts and economic hardship had become part of everyday conversation. Yet beyond the political turmoil and financial anxiety, life in countless towns and villages still moved at a slower pace than it does today. People knew their neighbors. Doors were often left unlocked for short periods. Children walked to school without constant supervision. A ringing telephone in the evening was more likely to be a relative than an emergency. For many families, home represented the one place where the outside world seemed unable to intrude. It was within this Britain that Donald Nielsen lived a life built on contradiction. To the people who encountered him in ordinary circumstances, there was little that immediately demanded attention. Born Donald Nappy in 1936, he had served in the British Army before returning to civilian life. Like thousands of former servicemen, he settled into family life, married, raised children, and held jobs that appeared unremarkable from the outside. There was no public image of an infamous outlaw, no lavish lifestyle that hinted at hidden wealth, and no reputation that openly connected him to a string of increasingly violent crimes. That ordinary appearance would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. Detectives would come to understand that Nielsen had become adept at separating two identities. One belonged to the quiet family man seen by neighbors. The other emerged in isolation, during long periods of planning and surveillance that preceded his crimes. This separation made him difficult to identify, not because he possessed extraordinary abilities, but because he blended into everyday life more successfully than many offenders. Over time, investigators reconstructed a picture of a man who devoted remarkable attention to preparation. Before committing robberies, he was known to observe locations, study access routes, and consider how quickly police might respond. His targets often included rural post offices and small businesses where security was limited and escape routes were relatively straightforward. These choices reflected calculation rather than impulse. By the early 1970s, Britain had already witnessed several armed robberies linked to the same offender. Some ended in fatal violence when victims attempted to intervene or resist. Those incidents intensified the nationwide search and contributed to the growing public fear surrounding the unidentified gunman. Newspapers had begun calling the Black Panther. The nickname referred to his preference for dark clothing during nighttime operations and quickly became part of the media narrative surrounding the case. While the public focused on the mystery of the nickname, detectives concentrated on patterns. The robber appeared patient. He often selected locations away from busy urban centers. He demonstrated familiarity with firearms. Most importantly, he seemed willing to wait until circumstances matched his plan rather than forcing opportunities that carried unnecessary risk. This patient approach distinguished him from many other armed robbers active during the period. Investigators increasingly believed they were dealing with someone who viewed crime less as a series of isolated events and more as a long-term undertaking shaped by observation and discipline. Meanwhile, roughly 70 miles away, the Whittle family represented a very different picture of Britain. The family had achieved financial success through business, a fact that had become publicly known within their community. Like many prosperous families, they attracted attention they neither sought nor fully appreciated. Public visibility, even when entirely legitimate, can unintentionally create vulnerability. Detectives would later examine how information about the family's circumstances may have contributed to their selection as a kidnapping target. At the center of that family was 17-year-old Leslie Whittle. Before she became known across Britain through newspaper headlines, she was simply a daughter, a sister, and a teenager living a life that looked remarkably ordinary. Family photographs from the period capture moments of everyday happiness rather than extraordinary privilege. They remind us that behind every widely reported criminal case are people whose identities extend far beyond the events that eventually define public memory. The quiet routines of the Whittle household stood in stark contrast to the secret preparations unfolding elsewhere. Those two worlds remained entirely separate until January 1975, when years of calculated criminal planning intersected with the life of a family that had no reason to imagine it had become the focus of one of Britain's most notorious offenders. The investigation would eventually reveal that the path leading to January 1975 had not been created overnight. It had been shaped over years, through a series of crimes that gradually increased both in ambition and in consequence. Understanding that progression is essential, because the kidnapping of Leslie Whittle did not emerge from a vacuum. It marked the escalation of an offender whose confidence had grown with each successful escape. During the early 1970s, police forces across northern England were confronted with a series of armed robberies that shared notable similarities. Small post offices and businesses in quieter locations were repeatedly targeted. The offender appeared to favor places where staffing was limited and where police response times might be longer than in larger towns or cities. Investigators observed recurring patterns in the planning and execution of these robberies, suggesting that the same individual or someone employing a highly consistent method could be responsible. As the incidents accumulated, so did concern. Unlike opportunistic thefts, these robberies involved firearms. In several cases, victims were shot after confronting the offender or attempting to intervene. The willingness to use lethal violence fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation. Detectives were no longer searching solely for an armed robber, they were searching for someone who had demonstrated that financial gain could take precedence over human life. The media followed these developments closely. Reports described a mysterious gunman who appeared and disappeared with remarkable efficiency, leaving investigators with frustratingly few leads. It was during this period that the press popularized the nickname the Black Panther, referring to the dark clothing reportedly worn during some of the nighttime offenses. Although memorable, the nickname also risked creating an image that overshadowed the practical reality confronting detectives, They were pursuing a disciplined offender whose apparent success stemmed less from myth than from careful preparation. That preparation became increasingly evident as investigators compared crime scenes. Locations had often been observed beforehand. Escape routes appeared to have been selected in advance. The offender showed awareness of timing, geography, and the practical challenges facing responding officers. None of these observations suggested perfection. Rather, they indicated patience. From an investigative standpoint, patience can be one of the most challenging characteristics to confront because it reduces the opportunities created by impulsive mistakes. Outside police circles, however, life continued much as it always had. Britain in the mid-1970s remained a country where communities were closely connected. News traveled through local papers, radio broadcasts, and conversations among neighbors. Families built routines around work, school, and weekends. Prosperity and hardship often existed side by side, yet most people shared a common expectation that serious violence belonged somewhere else, to distant headlines rather than familiar streets. The Whittle family was part of that everyday landscape. Their success in business had provided financial security, but it had also brought a degree of public visibility. Detectives later examined how information that was openly available at the time, including reporting about the family's circumstances, may have influenced the offender's decision to target them. There is no evidence that the family sought such attention or anticipated that it could expose them to danger. This context is significant because targeted crimes often begin long before victims become aware they have been selected. Surveillance, information gathering, and planning may occur quietly over extended periods. By the time an offense takes place, many of the critical decisions have already been made by the offender without the victim's knowledge. For investigators reconstructing events after the fact, this hidden period is often the most difficult to fully understand. What information was collected? How long did the planning last? Which observations proved decisive? Some of those questions can be answered through evidence recovered during an investigation. Others remain matters of informed reconstruction rather than certainty. As later court proceedings demonstrated, Donald Nielsen had devoted considerable effort to planning aspects of his criminal activity. That characteristic distinguished his offenses from spontaneous acts driven solely by immediate opportunity. Yet careful planning did not eliminate uncertainty. Every crime introduced variables that could not be completely controlled, including the responses of victims, witnesses, and law enforcement. This tension between preparation and unpredictability would become one of the defining features of the case. From a historical perspective, the investigation into Nielsen also reflected broader changes occurring within British policing during the decade. Cooperation between regional police forces was becoming increasingly important as offenders proved willing to travel across jurisdictional boundaries. Information sharing, coordination of intelligence, and comparison of crime patterns assumed greater significance in cases involving serial offending. At the time, however, those systems lacked many of the technological advantages available to modern investigators. There was no widespread use of digital surveillance, automatic vehicle recognition, or instant nationwide databases. Detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, physical evidence, careful record-keeping, and cooperation between individual officers and departments. Major investigations demanded extensive manpower, persistence, and time. Against this backdrop, Donald Nielsen remained unidentified. His ability to avoid capture did not indicate an absence of investigative effort. Rather, it reflected the considerable challenges facing police as they attempted to connect crimes committed over time and across different locations by an offender who actively sought to minimize the evidence he left behind. By the beginning of 1975, both sides were moving toward a pivotal moment without fully recognizing it. Nielsen was preparing for a crime unlike those that had previously defined his criminal career. Police continued pursuing an armed robber whose next move remained unknown. And the Whittle family carried on with the ordinary routines of daily life, unaware that they had become the focus of a plan that would soon command national attention and leave a lasting mark on British criminal history. There is a tendency, when looking back on historic criminal cases, to view the outcome as inevitable. Knowing how the story ends makes every earlier event seem like a warning sign that should have been obvious. Reality is rarely so clear. In January 1975, neither investigators nor the Whittle family possessed the advantage of hindsight. They were living through unfolding events, making decisions based only on the information available at the time. For the police, Donald Nielsen remained an unidentified offender linked to a series of serious crimes. His methods suggested discipline, but his identity, whereabouts, and future intentions were unknown. Detectives could analyze patterns, compare evidence, and issue appeals for information, yet they could not predict the precise moment or location of his next offense. For the Whittle family, life retained the familiar rhythms of home. Like countless families across Britain, they balanced work, school, social commitments, and everyday responsibilities. Their house was not a symbol of wealth to those who lived there. It was simply home, a place associated with birthdays, ordinary conversations, shared meals, and routines that had developed over years. That distinction is important. Criminal investigations often describe locations in terms of evidence and timelines, but before they become crime scenes, they are places where people build their lives. This contrast lies at the emotional heart of the case. One individual was preparing for a crime through observation and calculation. Another family was living without any reason to believe they had become the subject of that planning. The distance between those two realities could not have been greater. Looking back, investigators concluded that the kidnapping represented a significant escalation from Nielsen's earlier offenses. Armed robbery had already resulted in tragic loss of life, but kidnapping introduced an entirely different set of risks. It required prolonged control over a victim, communication with the victim's family, and the management of circumstances that could change rapidly and unpredictably. Even a carefully considered plan could be affected by factors beyond the offender's control. That unpredictability would ultimately shape the course of the case. In later years, criminologists and historians examined Donald Nielsen's offenses to better understand patterns of planning, target selection, and escalation. While interpretations differ in emphasis, there is broad agreement that the case illustrates how repeated criminal success can contribute to increasing confidence and, eventually, more ambitious offending. Confidence, however, should not be confused with certainty. Criminal plans remain vulnerable to unforeseen events, investigative persistence, and simple chance. Those themes would emerge repeatedly as the investigation unfolded. At the same time, the public response to the case reflected the social climate of Britain during the mid-1970s. News spread through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television bulletins. Major criminal investigations attracted widespread attention, and reports of violent crime could influence public perceptions of personal safety far beyond the communities directly affected. The nickname the Black Panther became familiar to many readers, yet behind the headlines lay a far more complex reality than any single phrase could capture. The lasting significance of this story does not rest in a nickname. It rests in the consequences of one criminal decision that affected an individual family, challenged investigators across multiple jurisdictions, and prompted continuing discussion about kidnapping investigations and ransom response procedures in Britain. As this story moves forward, the focus shifts away from the broader setting and toward the people whose lives would soon be irrevocably changed. The quiet routines of January 1975 were about to give way to one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in modern British history. Before detectives assembled evidence, before courtrooms heard testimony, and before the nation learned the full extent of Donald Nielsen's crimes, there was a family who believed they were beginning another ordinary day. They could not know that history was already moving toward their front door. The setting had been established. The people involved had taken their places, unaware of how closely their paths were about to converge. The stage was now set for the human story at the center of this case, the life of Leslie Whittle, the hopes she carried, the family who loved her, and the devastating events that would forever connect her name with one of Britain's most notorious criminal investigations. Before her name became known across Britain, Leslie Whittle was not a headline or a symbol of a national tragedy. She was a 17-year-old young woman with a family, friends, routines, and the ordinary expectations of someone standing at the beginning of adult life. It is easy, in retrospect, to view her only through the lens of the crime that would later dominate newspaper front pages. Doing so, however, risks reducing an entire life to a single event. The historical record paints the picture of a teenager growing up in Staffordshire during the 1970s. The Whittle family was financially comfortable through the success of the family business, a fact that became widely reported after the kidnapping. Yet prosperity alone says very little about the daily reality of family life. Like many households, theirs was shaped by routines, responsibilities, celebrations, and the small interactions that rarely find their way into police files or court transcripts. Family photographs from the period, reproduced in contemporary news coverage and archival material, show ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. They capture birthdays, holidays, and everyday family life, the kinds of images that exist in countless family albums. These photographs remind us that victims of major crimes had identities long before they entered public consciousness. By January 1975, Leslie was at an age when many young people begin thinking seriously about the future. School, friendships, family relationships, and growing independence formed the backdrop to her daily life. Although later media coverage often emphasized the family's financial circumstances because they were relevant to the kidnapping, those circumstances should not overshadow the fact that Leslie herself had no role in becoming a target. Investigators concluded that she was selected because of decisions made entirely by the offender. That distinction matters. Crimes such as kidnapping are acts imposed upon victims. They are not events invited, anticipated, or influenced by ordinary choices made by those who become their targets. For detectives, understanding the victim's background serves several purposes. It helps establish routines, identify possible contacts, and reconstruct the final days before the offense. In Leslie Whittle's case, investigators found no evidence that she had knowingly placed herself in circumstances that explained the crime. Instead, the inquiry increasingly pointed toward a carefully planned offense directed at her family rather than at her personally. This realization shaped the investigation from an early stage. Rather than focusing on personal disputes or acquaintances, detectives were required to consider a broader possibility, that the victim had been chosen because she represented access to a ransom payment. Looking back today, it is important to remember that Leslie Whittle occupies a central place in British criminal history not because of anything she did, but because of what was done to her. The enduring lesson of the case is not the notoriety of the offender, but the profound human cost borne by a young woman and her family. As the investigation would later demonstrate, every major decision made after her disappearance, from police strategy to media reporting, would be influenced by the hope that she could still be brought home safely. That hope would define the opening days of one of Britain's most significant kidnapping investigations and remains an essential part of understanding the case today. To understand why the kidnapping of Leslie Whittle resonated so deeply across Britain, it is necessary to consider not only the crime itself but also the public response to it. Kidnappings for ransom were exceptionally rare in Britain during the 1970s. While armed robberies and other violent offences had occurred, the deliberate abduction of a teenager for financial gain represented a form of crime that many people associated more readily with fictional stories or events abroad than with everyday life in England. The rarity of such cases contributed to the intense media attention that followed Leslie's disappearance. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio reports closely monitored developments as investigators worked to determine her whereabouts. Public interest reflected both concern for the victim and uncertainty about how such a crime should be understood. For detectives, however, the immediate priority was practical rather than symbolic. Investigators sought to establish an accurate timeline of events, identify potential witnesses, examine the family's recent activities, and determine whether any communications from the offender could assist in locating Leslie safely. In cases involving ransom demands, every decision carries significant consequences. Law enforcement agencies must balance the urgency of protecting the victim with the need to preserve evidence and identify those responsible. Historical accounts indicate that the investigation required extensive coordination between police personnel and the Whittle family during a period of considerable uncertainty. As additional information emerged, detectives increasingly concluded that the kidnapping had been carefully planned rather than opportunistic. Evidence suggested that the offender had selected the family in advance and had acted with a specific objective in mind. This finding was consistent with what investigators already suspected about the individual later identified as Donald Nielsen. His earlier criminal activity demonstrated a pattern of preparation, surveillance, and deliberate target selection. Although he had not yet been publicly identified as the offender, the methods employed in the kidnapping would later be examined alongside evidence from his previous crimes. For the Whittle family, the experience unfolded under extraordinary pressure. While aspects of their interactions with investigators have been documented through court records and contemporary reporting, it is important to distinguish between verified facts and later speculation. Numerous books and documentaries have revisited the case over the decades, sometimes reaching different conclusions about investigative decisions. However, the central historical facts remain clear. The family cooperated with the authorities during a rapidly developing investigation in which preserving the victim's life was the overriding concern. The case also highlighted broader challenges facing British policing in the mid-1970s. Communication systems, forensic techniques, and investigative technologies were far less advanced than those available today. Detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, physical evidence, telephone records, and coordinated field inquiries. Large-scale investigations demanded substantial manpower and often required cooperation across multiple jurisdictions. In retrospect, the kidnapping of Leslie Whittle became more than a single criminal investigation. It prompted continued discussion among law enforcement professionals regarding the handling of ransom cases, interagency coordination, and the management of sensitive communications with victims' families. These discussions contributed to the evolution of investigative practices in the years that followed. As the inquiry progressed, attention increasingly focused on identifying the individual responsible. What had begun as an urgent search for a missing teenager was developing into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Britain during the 1970s. Detectives were assembling evidence piece by piece, unaware that the offender had already attracted attention in connection with other serious crimes. The separate threads of those investigations would eventually converge, fundamentally altering the direction of the case and leading investigators toward the man who had spent years avoiding identification, Donald Nielsen. To understand the full weight of the Leslie Whittle case, it is important to look beyond the investigation, beyond the headlines, and beyond the name that appeared repeatedly in newspapers throughout 1975. A victim is never defined by the crime committed against them. Before the world knew her name, Leslie Whittle was a young woman living an ordinary life, surrounded by people who knew her not as part of a criminal case, but as a daughter, a family member, and a friend. The public record surrounding Leslie is understandably limited. Unlike the offender whose actions generated extensive police files, courtroom discussions, and media coverage, much of Leslie's personal life remained private. This is often the reality in true crime cases. The person who suffers the greatest loss is frequently the person about whom the least is publicly known. That absence of information should not be mistaken for a lack of importance. In many ways, it is a reminder of the tragedy itself. Leslie's life was not defined by the moment she became a victim. It existed long before that moment. She was born into the Whittle family, a household that had achieved financial security through business success. Her father, George Whittle, was associated with a successful transport-related business, and the family's circumstances later became a factor in why they were targeted by Donald Nielsen. However, wealth was only one small part of their identity. Behind the public descriptions of a wealthy family was a private household with the same kinds of relationships and routines found in families everywhere. The Whittles were not living a life of constant protection or isolation. They were part of their community. They had neighbors, acquaintances, and connections built over years. Their financial circumstances did not make them expect danger. Like most people at the time, they had no reason to believe that their home would become connected to one of Britain's most notorious criminal investigations. For Leslie, the world of 1975 was still filled with possibilities. At 17 years old, she was at an important stage of life. She was no longer a child, but she was not yet fully independent. Like many teenagers of her generation, she was growing into adulthood while still closely connected to her family. The future ahead of her was open and uncertain in the ordinary way young people's futures are uncertain. There were choices still to be made. Places still to visit. People still to meet. Experiences still waiting to happen. The cruelty of crimes like this is not only found in the suffering they cause in the present. It is also found in everything they erase, the years that should have followed, the milestones that should have been celebrated, and the person a victim would have continued becoming. When newspapers reported the kidnapping, the public naturally focused on the urgency of finding Leslie. Every update carried the possibility of hope or fear. Behind those reports, however, was a family trying to navigate an unimaginable situation while facing intense public attention. The Whittle family's private suffering became part of a national story. Their home became a place surrounded by reporters and investigators. Their personal tragedy became a subject discussed by strangers across the country. This is one of the difficult realities of high-profile crimes. The search for information that helps solve a case can also mean that victims and their families lose control over their own stories. Details that would normally remain private become part of public discussion. Photographs, personal histories, and family circumstances become examined by people who never knew them. For Leslie, the media coverage created a lasting public image connected almost entirely to the crime. But a person's life cannot be measured by the final event that happened to them. She was not simply the kidnapped teenager. She was a young woman who had a family that loved her. She was someone whose absence created a space that could never be filled. She was someone whose name became associated with a national investigation, yet whose own hopes and future mattered far more than the actions of the man who took them away. This distinction is especially important when discussing offenders like Donald Nielsen. The attention surrounding notorious criminals can sometimes unintentionally shift focus toward their methods, their intelligence, or their ability to evade capture. Books and documentaries often examine how offenders think and how investigations unfold. Those elements may help explain criminal behavior, but they should never overshadow the person who suffered because of it. The story of Leslie Whittle is ultimately a story about human potential interrupted. At the time of her disappearance, investigators did not know how the case would end. The public did not know how long the search would continue. Her family could only hope that the outcome would be different from the tragedies associated with other kidnapping cases. That uncertainty became one of the defining features of the investigation. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried consequences. Every possibility had to be considered. The officers working the case were not simply investigating a crime scene. They were searching for a person whose life had been placed in danger. And as the investigation expanded, Britain would begin to understand that this was not only the story of an elusive criminal. It was the story of a young woman whose name would forever be remembered because of circumstances she never chose. Leslie Whittle entered history unwillingly. She became known because someone else made a series of deliberate decisions. But the lasting importance of her story is not the criminal who targeted her. It is the reminder that behind every case file, every newspaper headline, and every courtroom record, there are real lives that existed before the crime and continued to matter long after the investigation ended. By the evening of the 14th of January, 1975, the Whittle household appeared outwardly ordinary. Nothing in the family's routine suggested that they had become the focus of a carefully planned criminal act. According to the evidence later presented in court, Donald Nielsen had selected the family in advance and had prepared for the kidnapping over a period of time rather than acting spontaneously. During the night, Nielsen entered the Whittle family home. The intrusion represented a significant escalation from the armed robberies that had previously characterized his criminal activity. Unlike a robbery, which is typically completed within minutes, a kidnapping requires the offender to maintain control over events for an extended period. It also depends upon subsequent communication with the victim's family and introduces numerous uncertainties that cannot be fully anticipated. The evidence established during the investigation showed that Leslie Whittle was abducted from the house and taken away by Nielsen. This was the beginning of a case that would rapidly become one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in Britain. In the hours immediately following the abduction, the family and investigators faced profound uncertainty. Establishing exactly what had occurred, determining the victim's whereabouts, and assessing the intentions of the offender became urgent priorities. As is common in kidnapping investigations, information was incomplete, and every confirmed fact assumed considerable importance. Subsequent evidence demonstrated that Nielsen had transported Leslie to a remote location within a disused drainage system. He had chosen the site before the kidnapping, reflecting the degree of planning involved in the offense. Investigators later concluded that the location was intended to reduce the likelihood of accidental discovery while he pursued a ransom demand directed at the family. The ransom demand fundamentally shaped the investigation. Law enforcement authorities were required to balance several competing priorities: protecting the victim, preserving opportunities to identify the offender, and responding appropriately to communications intended to secure payment. These are among the most complex circumstances investigators encounter, as decisions often must be made with incomplete information and under significant time pressure. The handling of ransom communications has been the subject of extensive analysis in the decades since the case. Historians and policing experts have examined investigative procedures employed at the time, recognizing both the limitations of available technology in the mid-1970s and the difficult judgments required of officers working under extraordinary pressure. Modern policing practices have evolved considerably, informed in part by lessons drawn from cases such as this one. As the investigation unfolded, Donald Nielsen remained unidentified publicly. Although detectives had spent years investigating a series of armed robberies committed by an unknown offender, they did not yet know that the same individual was responsible for the kidnapping. Connecting these separate strands of criminal activity required evidence that would only emerge later. For the Whittle family, however, the immediate concern was not identifying the offender's broader criminal history. Their priority was the safe return of Leslie. Every communication, every development, and every investigative decision was viewed through that lens. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it is possible to see how the case marked a turning point in Nielsen's criminal career. The kidnapping exposed him to risks fundamentally different from those associated with earlier robberies. It required prolonged interaction with the consequences of his actions rather than a rapid departure from the scene. That change would ultimately contribute to the accumulation of evidence and investigative attention that later led to his identification and arrest. At the time, however, none of those outcomes were known. Investigators, the Whittle family, and the wider public remained confronted by the same urgent question: where was Leslie Whittle, and could she be found before it was too late? The answer to that question would depend on a rapidly developing investigation whose most critical discoveries still lay ahead. The kidnapping of Leslie Whittle quickly transformed from a private family tragedy into a national emergency. Within a short period of time, the case drew the attention of investigators, journalists, and the public across Britain. What initially appeared to be the disappearance of a young woman soon revealed itself to be a carefully organized criminal operation, one that would challenge police methods and leave a lasting impact on the history of British crime. The investigation began under extraordinary pressure because kidnapping cases operate under a unique set of circumstances. Unlike many crimes where investigators first focus on identifying what happened after the event has ended, kidnapping investigations unfold while the victim's safety remains uncertain. Every action taken by police must consider not only the pursuit of the offender but also the immediate protection of the person being held. In Leslie Whittle's case, investigators had to work within an environment of limited information. They knew a young woman had been taken from her home. They knew a ransom demand was involved. They knew the offender had planned the operation carefully. But they did not yet know the full extent of the preparation behind it, the exact location where Leslie was being held, or how the situation would develop. The evidence later presented during legal proceedings showed that Donald Nielsen had selected a hidden location for the purpose of concealing Leslie during the kidnapping. The site, located in a disused drainage area in the West Midlands, reflected the offender's preference for isolation and control. It was not a location chosen by chance. It was part of a plan designed around secrecy and reducing the likelihood of discovery. However, the very nature of such a plan created challenges for the person attempting to carry it out. A hidden location can reduce visibility, but it can also create distance and complications. Communication becomes more difficult. Conditions can change unexpectedly. The offender must continue making decisions while dealing with circumstances that cannot be completely controlled. This became a central feature of the case. Nielsen had spent years attempting to remove uncertainty from his crimes. His previous offenses demonstrated a strong focus on preparation and escape. But kidnapping introduced a different kind of risk. It required him to manage an extended situation involving another human being, a frightened family, and law enforcement officers actively attempting to locate him. The investigation intensified as police attempted to trace the communications connected to the ransom demand. At the time, investigators did not have access to the modern technologies now used in major criminal cases. There were no instant digital records, advanced location systems, or nationwide electronic databases capable of connecting information within seconds. Instead, detectives relied on traditional investigative methods. They analyzed statements. They examined physical evidence. They coordinated information between departments. They considered links between the kidnapping and previous unsolved crimes. The possibility that the offender responsible for Leslie's abduction might also be connected to the Black Panther robberies became increasingly significant as investigators examined the evidence. The similarities in planning and method suggested that the kidnapping was not an isolated event committed by an unknown individual, but potentially another stage in the activities of a criminal already known to authorities. This realization changed the nature of the investigation. The search was no longer only for a kidnapper. It was also a search for a man who had already demonstrated a willingness to use extreme violence. For the British public, the case created a mixture of fear and fascination. The media coverage was extensive, and each new development attracted national attention. Yet behind the public discussion was a family experiencing an intensely personal crisis. The Whittle family's circumstances became known to millions of people, but public awareness could not reduce the uncertainty they faced. The emotional impact of kidnapping cases is often difficult to describe because families are forced to exist between two impossible realities. They must hope for the victim's safe return while also confronting the possibility of the worst outcome. Time becomes both a source of hope and a source of fear. Every passing hour can bring new information. Every passing hour can also increase anxiety. The investigation into Leslie's disappearance continued under these pressures. Officers followed leads, reviewed evidence, and attempted to understand the offender's behavior. The case required patience and precision because a mistake could have serious consequences. As the days passed, the carefully constructed plan that Donald Nielsen had created began to encounter the unpredictable nature of real events. A criminal may believe that preparation provides complete control, but no plan exists outside the influence of other people, circumstances, and chance. The kidnapping of Leslie Whittle would ultimately become the crime that brought Donald Nielsen's entire criminal history into focus. The robberies, the violence, and the years spent avoiding capture were no longer separate incidents. They became connected pieces of a larger investigation. But before that connection could be fully proven, investigators still had to uncover the evidence that would reveal who was responsible. The search for answers had only begun. As the investigation continued, one of the most difficult challenges facing authorities was the absence of certainty. In a case involving a missing person and a ransom demand, every possibility must be considered. Investigators cannot assume they understand the offender's intentions, and they cannot rely on the patterns of previous crimes alone. They must work with fragments of information, often while knowing that the consequences of delay may be irreversible. The kidnapping of Leslie Whittle placed detectives in exactly that position. They were dealing with an offender who had demonstrated patience and preparation in previous crimes. Donald Nielsen had not built his criminal reputation through sudden acts of chaos. His earlier offenses showed a pattern of careful observation and deliberate action. This meant investigators were not searching for someone likely to make obvious mistakes immediately. They were attempting to identify a person who had spent years trying to avoid detection. That created a difficult balance. Police had to move quickly because Leslie's safety was the priority. At the same time, they had to move carefully because the offender's reaction to pressure could not be predicted. Kidnapping investigations often involve a psychological struggle between control and uncertainty. The offender attempts to create a situation where the victim and the victim's family depend on his decisions. Law enforcement attempts to restore control by gathering information, identifying patterns, and reducing the offender's ability to operate unseen. In this case, Nielsen attempted to maintain that control through planning. The evidence later revealed that he had prepared written instructions connected to the ransom demand and had established procedures intended to guide the family's response. These actions reflected the same characteristics seen throughout his criminal career: organization, secrecy, and an effort to anticipate possible obstacles. However, the existence of a plan does not guarantee the outcome a criminal expects. Every step introduces new variables. Every communication creates evidence. Every interaction provides investigators with opportunities to learn more about the person responsible. This was particularly important because, despite Nielsen's efforts to remain anonymous, criminals often reveal aspects of themselves through their methods. The language they use, the locations they select, the way they organize events, and the mistakes they make can all provide clues. A carefully planned crime may reduce evidence, but it rarely eliminates it completely. For detectives working the case, understanding the offender's behavior became just as important as collecting physical evidence. They needed to consider not only what had happened, but why certain choices had been made. Why had this family been selected? Why had this location been chosen? Why had the offender used this particular method? Each question represented another attempt to reconstruct the thinking behind the crime. The challenge was that reconstruction always happens after the fact. Investigators were attempting to understand decisions made by someone who had deliberately concealed his intentions. They had to separate reliable evidence from assumptions and avoid being influenced by the public image that was forming around the case. Outside the investigation, the media continued to report developments, and the name the Black Panther remained familiar to many members of the public. The nickname created a powerful image, but investigators knew that the person behind it was not a fictional character. He was a man who had committed real crimes against real people. The distinction mattered. Public fascination with notorious offenders can sometimes shift attention toward their methods and personalities. However, the central reality of the case remained the same. A young woman had been taken from her home, and a family was waiting for answers. As the search continued, investigators examined connections between the kidnapping and earlier crimes. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The offender's approach, his level of preparation, and his willingness to use violence reflected patterns already associated with the unidentified armed robber who had troubled police for years. The possibility that these crimes were connected represented a major development. If confirmed, it meant that the kidnapping investigation was not beginning from zero. Police already possessed years of information about the offender's methods, even if they did not yet know his identity. The challenge was turning patterns into proof. In criminal investigations, suspicion is not enough. A theory must be supported by evidence. A connection must be demonstrated. A suspect must be linked to specific actions through facts that can withstand examination in court. That process would take time. Meanwhile, the most important question remained unanswered: where was Leslie Whittle? For everyone involved, the passage of time carried a different meaning. For investigators, it meant increasing urgency. For the family, it meant continued uncertainty. For the offender, it represented the continuation of a plan that he believed he controlled. But history would eventually show that the kidnapping of Leslie Whittle became the point where Donald Nielsen's carefully maintained separation between himself and his crimes began to collapse. The investigation was no longer simply following a trail left by an unknown criminal. It was moving toward identifying one of Britain's most wanted men. and the evidence needed to uncover the truth was already beginning to emerge. The discovery phase of any major criminal investigation is often where uncertainty begins to transform into reality. Before evidence can be analyzed, before suspects can be identified, and before a courtroom can examine the facts, investigators must first confront the physical truth of what has happened. In the case of Leslie Whittle, that moment would become one of the most devastating turning points in the entire investigation. 4 days, police officers had been working under the pressure of incomplete information. The focus remained on locating Leslie and determining whether she could still be found alive. Behind every investigative decision was the same urgent objective: finding the missing teenager. The search involved extensive police work, including the examination of possible locations connected to the offender's instructions and movements. Investigators had to interpret information left behind by a criminal who had attempted to maintain control over every stage of the kidnapping. The difficulty was that Donald Nielsen had chosen a location designed to remain hidden. The place where Leslie was held was not an obvious hiding spot. It was an abandoned drainage area beneath the ground, away from ordinary activity and separated from the public spaces where people normally move. The choice reflected Nielsen's approach to crime: concealment, preparation, and reducing the chance of accidental discovery. However, hidden places are not invisible forever. Every criminal investigation eventually reaches a point where the search moves from uncertainty toward evidence. In this case, investigators eventually located the underground site connected to the kidnapping. What they discovered there changed the direction of the case permanently. Leslie Whittle was found dead. The hope that had surrounded the search was replaced by the reality that the investigation was now a murder inquiry. For those involved, the case was no longer only about finding a missing person or negotiating a ransom demand. It became a pursuit of justice for a young woman whose life had been taken. The discovery had a profound impact beyond the immediate investigation. It confirmed the worst fears of the Whittle family and intensified public attention across Britain. A case that had already shocked the country became even more significant because it revealed the full extent of the danger posed by the offender. For detectives, the location itself became a crucial source of evidence. Crime scenes often tell stories that cannot be understood from a single piece of information. The arrangement of objects, the physical environment, and the materials left behind can help investigators reconstruct events. In a case involving a carefully planned kidnapping, the scene provided insight into the offender's preparation and methods. Investigators examined every available detail. The location. The items recovered. The materials connected to the ransom plan. The circumstances surrounding Leslie's death. Each piece contributed to the larger picture they were attempting to build. The abandoned drainage system also highlighted one of the defining characteristics of Nielsen's criminal behavior: his preference for control. Throughout his offenses, he had repeatedly attempted to reduce uncertainty by choosing conditions that favored him. Remote locations, careful planning, and preparation were recurring elements. Yet the investigation demonstrated a fundamental reality of criminal behavior. Control is never absolute. The more complicated a crime becomes, the more opportunities exist for evidence to appear. A robbery may last minutes. A kidnapping unfolds over days. Every additional action creates another connection between the offender and the crime. Forensic investigators and detectives began the painstaking process of examining what Nielsen had left behind. At the time, forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today, but careful evidence collection remained essential. Investigators relied on physical examination, witness information, documentation, and the comparison of details across multiple crimes. The discovery also intensified the connection between the kidnapping and the earlier crimes attributed to the Black Panther. The methods, planning, and willingness to use violence appeared consistent with the offender police had been searching for. The case had now reached a critical stage. The question was no longer simply what happened to Leslie Whittle. The question was who was responsible. 4 years, Donald Nielsen had operated under the assumption that careful planning could keep him beyond the reach of law enforcement. But the discovery of the crime scene created a new reality. The investigation now had a physical foundation. Evidence could be examined. Patterns could be compared. The offender, who had spent years avoiding identification, had left behind a trail that investigators could finally follow. The public response was one of shock and grief. Many people who had followed the case through news reports had hoped for a different outcome. The death of a 17-year-old girl transformed the national conversation from concern and uncertainty into anger and demands for justice. But for investigators, emotion could not replace evidence. The task ahead was clear. They needed to connect the crime scene to the offender. They needed to prove the identity of the person responsible. And they needed to understand how a man who had spent years operating in secrecy could finally be brought into the light. The discovery beneath the ground marked the end of one search. But it was also the beginning of another. The search for the truth. The recovery of Leslie Whittle's body marked a painful turning point, but it also provided investigators with something they had been searching for since the beginning of the case: a physical connection between the crime and the person responsible. Before the discovery, police were working against uncertainty. They had a kidnapping, a ransom demand, and a suspected offender who had carefully avoided revealing his identity. After the discovery, the investigation entered a different phase. The question was no longer only where Leslie had been taken. It was how the offender had planned the crime, what evidence he had left behind, and how those details could be used to identify him. The location itself became one of the most important elements of the investigation. The underground drainage system where Leslie was found was not a random place. It reflected the offender's preference for isolation and concealment. It was an environment chosen because it offered privacy and reduced the likelihood of discovery. Investigators studying the scene recognized that the location provided insight into the preparation behind the crime. The site also demonstrated a recurring pattern in Donald Nielsen's offenses. He did not rely on chance. He attempted to control circumstances before they happened. In previous robberies, this approach had allowed him to avoid capture for years. He studied locations, considered escape routes, and attempted to minimize risks. The kidnapping followed the same philosophy. It was not an impulsive act carried out without preparation. It was a deliberate operation built around planning. However, the scene also revealed the limitations of that approach. A criminal can plan where a crime begins, but cannot fully control everything that follows. Unexpected events, human responses, and investigative methods can disrupt even carefully prepared actions. Every decision creates consequences, and every consequence can leave evidence. For detectives, the crime scene became a source of information. They examined the physical surroundings carefully, documenting details and collecting material that could later be compared with other evidence. In major investigations, the smallest details can become significant when combined with other information. A single item may appear meaningless on its own, but when placed alongside witness statements, previous crimes, and suspect behavior, it can help form a complete picture. This was particularly important because Nielsen's greatest advantage had always been anonymity. For years, he had existed as an unknown figure behind a series of violent crimes. Police knew the methods, but not the man. They understood the pattern, but not the identity. The discovery at the drainage system began changing that balance. Investigators could now examine the kidnapping alongside the earlier crimes connected to the Black Panther. They were no longer looking at separate incidents. They were examining a possible criminal history belonging to one individual. The connection was significant because the earlier robberies had already provided police with valuable knowledge about the offender's behavior. They knew he was methodical. They knew he was willing to use firearms. They knew he planned carefully. They knew he avoided unnecessary attention. The kidnapping had added another dimension, the ability to maintain a long-term criminal operation involving planning, communication, and concealment. As the investigation expanded, officers continued reviewing information collected over previous years. Files that had once represented separate unsolved crimes were reconsidered through a new perspective. A vehicle sighting from one case, a witness statement from another, or a detail from an earlier crime could take on new significance when viewed alongside the kidnapping evidence. This process is one of the most important aspects of major criminal investigations. Evidence rarely arrives as a complete answer. More often, it appears as scattered pieces that must be assembled patiently. Detectives must constantly ask whether a detail is meaningful or simply coincidence. They must avoid assumptions while recognizing patterns. They must build a case based on facts rather than the desire for a particular conclusion. The investigation into Donald Nielsen required exactly that approach. The public already knew the name associated with fear. The newspapers had created an image of the mysterious Black Panther. But investigators needed something more valuable than public suspicion. They needed proof. The discovery of Leslie's body also intensified pressure on law enforcement. A case that had already attracted national attention now carried even greater urgency. The public wanted answers, and the family deserved justice. Every investigative decision was examined closely because the consequences involved not only solving a notorious crime but also holding a dangerous offender accountable. At the same time, the case raised difficult questions about how such crimes could occur and how they could be prevented in the future. The kidnapping demonstrated the challenges faced by police when dealing with an offender who was organized, mobile, and willing to commit serious violence. The lessons from the case would later influence discussions about kidnapping response procedures and criminal investigations in Britain. The importance of coordination between police forces, careful handling of ransom cases, and the value of connecting information across multiple investigations became increasingly clear. But before those lessons could be fully understood, investigators still had one central task ahead. They needed to identify the man behind the crimes. The discovery had revealed the seriousness of what had happened. The evidence would eventually reveal who had done it. And the search for that evidence would lead detectives deeper into the criminal history of Donald Nielsen, the former soldier, the quiet neighbor, and the man who had spent years hiding behind an ordinary appearance while carrying out some of the most shocking crimes in Britain during the 1970s. The discovery of Leslie Whittle was the moment when the investigation moved from a desperate search into a full-scale pursuit of a murderer. For the officers involved, there was no longer the uncertainty of whether they would find her alive. The painful reality was now confirmed, and the purpose of the investigation changed forever. They were no longer searching for a missing person. They were building a case. In the aftermath of the discovery, investigators faced the difficult task of examining a crime scene that had been deliberately chosen to conceal evidence as much as possible. The underground drainage system was isolated, unfamiliar, and far removed from the everyday environments where most people lived and worked. It was a location selected because it offered the offender privacy and distance from public attention. But isolation does not mean immunity. Every place where a crime occurs contains information. The environment itself can reveal choices made by the offender. The route taken to reach the location, the objects brought there, the methods used, and the decisions made afterward can all provide clues about preparation and behavior. For detectives, the scene became a silent record of Donald Nielsen's actions. It showed that the kidnapping had required planning beyond the initial abduction. A location had been considered. Arrangements had been made. The offender had invested time into creating a situation where he believed he could maintain control. This pattern was consistent with what police had already learned from the earlier crimes connected to the Black Panther. Nielsen's previous offenses had demonstrated a similar approach. He was not an offender who acted without preparation. He observed, planned, and attempted to reduce risks. He relied on patience rather than speed, and secrecy rather than attention. However, the discovery also exposed the weakness in his method. The more carefully a criminal constructs an operation, the more decisions must be made. The more decisions made, the more opportunities exist for mistakes. Every movement creates a possibility of being observed. Every communication creates a possibility of being traced. Every object left behind creates a possibility of connection. Investigators began the painstaking process of gathering and analyzing evidence. In the 1970s, forensic science did not have the advanced tools available today. There were no instant digital searches or automated systems capable of comparing information across national databases. Much of the work depended on careful examination, detailed records, and the experience of investigators. This made traditional detective work essential. Officers reviewed timelines. They compared information from different police forces. They re-examined previous incidents. They searched for patterns that could link apparently separate crimes. The kidnapping of Leslie Whittle provided a crucial opportunity because it connected an unknown offender to a specific event with a detailed investigation behind it. The earlier robberies had created a profile of behavior, but the kidnapping produced a new collection of evidence and circumstances that could be studied. The connection between the crimes became increasingly important. The same characteristics appeared repeatedly. The offender showed patience. He prepared extensively. He selected vulnerable targets. He attempted to control every stage of the crime. These similarities helped investigators understand that they were not dealing with separate acts committed by unrelated individuals. Instead, they were looking at a continuing criminal pattern. At the same time, the discovery intensified public reaction throughout Britain. The case had already attracted national attention because of the unusual nature of the kidnapping. The confirmation of Leslie's death created widespread grief and anger. Many people who had followed the search felt a personal connection to the tragedy, despite never having met the Whittle family. This reaction reflected something deeper about the case. It was not only the seriousness of the crime that affected the public. It was the fact that Leslie represented the vulnerability of ordinary life. She was a teenager. She was a daughter. She was someone whose future had been taken away by another person's decisions. The attention surrounding the case also placed significant pressure on investigators. The public wanted answers, but criminal investigations cannot be solved through pressure alone. Detectives needed evidence that could withstand examination in court. They needed facts, not assumptions. This distinction became increasingly important as suspicion began to focus on Donald Nielsen. Knowing someone may be responsible is not the same as proving it. A successful prosecution requires a chain of evidence connecting a person to a specific crime. Investigators needed to establish not only that Nielsen was involved in criminal activity, but that he was responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Leslie Whittle. The search for those connections would involve reviewing years of information. Files that had once seemed unrelated would be examined again. Old witness accounts would gain new importance. Previous investigations would be revisited with fresh understanding. The man who had spent years avoiding capture had created a long history of criminal activity, and that history would ultimately become one of the factors that brought him closer to justice. The discovery beneath the ground had revealed the tragic outcome of the kidnapping. But it also revealed something else. Donald Nielsen had not committed a crime that existed in isolation. He had left behind a pattern. And patterns, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of becoming visible over time. The next stage of the investigation would focus on uncovering that pattern completely, identifying the man behind the crimes, and bringing the evidence together in a way that could answer the question that had remained unanswered for years. Who was the person hiding behind the name the Black Panther?